Good day. I'm Scott O'Kander, one of the founding partners and chief leadership strategist here at Carnegie Higher Ed. I'm here to talk to you today about one of the more important topics in higher ed and enrollment strategy, and that is how the market is changing and how we must adjust our search strategy to think about search differently moving forward. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and I welcome your comments and questions. But to get at the main highlights of the presentation, I want to start by just talking about how search is today versus what it was, say 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. So I'll title that a brief and incomplete history of now and then and now. I'm also going to talk about several key trends that are changing or starting and some that are ending as it relates to search today. All of that will be used to just sort of lay out for you a way of rethinking search strategy as we move forward. And I'll talk briefly about how Carnegie is entering this space with some new opportunities for our clients to partner on some of the key strategies that will address search and the market as we move forward. So to get at that, I want to start with just a brief and incomplete history of search as we think about it. For some of you, you might be new to the industry. Others have been VPs of enrollment like I was years and years ago. And so what has changed and where are we today? So if you think about search as a strategy, you kind of go back all the way back to the 90s and 2000s, when I would call that era, if you will, the top of funnel era. That's an era where the industry itself was growing at double-digit growth rates. There's new technology entering the markets like email. I know it's hard to say email as a new technology, but it is and was. You have websites coming online. You have smartphones in the mid-2000s. So a lot of the sort of era that defined many search strategies that are still in place today are really driven by this idea of putting as many names as you can reasonably put in the top of the funnel, and then allowing those names to then, work through a set of attempted conversions to a matriculant class. We have, for many institutions, have had very successful attempts at this over the years, but that is sort of changed, and it's changed for many institutions I speak with, mostly because of what's happened in the time since then. And so if we look at the next little bit of time, then from say 2013 to sort of maybe 2020, we start thinking about an era which I would define as kind of the growth fracture. Now the industry isn't growing at double-digit growth per year. In fact, now we see the growth rates changing by region. So we see places like the Midwest and Northeast are growing at much slower to even negative growth rates. And we have places like in the South, like Atlanta and Houston and Denver and in the West and LA, where you see really massive growth continuing. That has, sort of an imbalanced effect on how institutions approach the enrollment equation and the search equation. You have grad booms, you have competitive positions that are starting to become more fierce. You have geographic expansion. So schools that are in weaker growth rates are looking for markets like that I mentioned, like Atlanta or Houston or Dallas or Denver, where there is growth to try to sort of build competitive positions in those spaces and competing with institutions that were not essentially familiar in terms of competitors in the past. And you have also a rise in chief marketing officers, in part driven by new channel strategies. I mean, Carnegie sort of introduced digital marketing to higher education back in 2013, about 10 years ago. But the chief marketing officer is now in this era one of the biggest hires that institutions make, and it's becoming one of the key ideas to sort of stand out and separate yourself from your competition through a strong brand and better marketing and things like that. All of this leads to sort of a peak in enrollment around 2018, where we now see the last of the sort of bigger growth eras. And now from that point on, we're starting to see growth waning as a general idea. We see a rise in campus mergers, closures, restructurings. We see market consolidation. That sort of activity is less and less the reality of a growth industry and more a function of a market share industry. So if we look at today, then we kind of see coming out of the pandemic, we're sitting here in 2023 with a wild set of new market realities compared to 10 years ago. We have a really high degree of increased competition and overall demand compression in many, many markets. We see the value of higher education shifting within our Gen Z and Gen Alpha audiences. We see regulatory pressures from things like privacy or SCOTUS or the FAFSA changes that are changing really the data standard. And what we can expect to do in market and out of market and how we have to regulate ourselves for it. We also have a world where we see so much technology enhancement and innovation. Things like AI have come on board in a fierce way for both analytics and content development, as well as content sort of monitoring. So today's faculty may have to look at essays being written and for the effect of AI versus just pen to paper like it was in my sort of era. And then you have sort of geopolitical issues like inflationary factors like higher interest rates and concerns about things like environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and the political landscape that could, as we see almost every week in the news, some sort of radical change in the way the government seems to operate. And all of this that I mentioned here is happening today. And yet the actual demographic cliff that I've heard so many institutions talk about and so many cabinets wrestle with is actually still a few years away and will last us for over a decade beyond that. So we see this pronounced era of the next sort of 14, 15 years or so, where we're going to be in an era of demand compression. And I'm calling this the demand-driven era in search. And the approach has to meet that sort of market level factor in reality as we move forward. So just in numbers terms, we look at things like 1 million fewer test takers today than there were in 2019. Now, some of that's related to test optional, but that is a big change in the overall lead generation landscape for higher ed. If you can't go to your familiar sources like College Board and Inquira and just buy ACT or SAT names in the same volume, that requires a different kind of strategy moving forward. We have things like 25% of Gen Zers now say they discovered one or more schools through social media versus the traditional sort of pattern. So that sort of opens up this frontier of how do we reach students? How do we find authentic, organic, rich data-filled students that might not exist in the typical sort of name buy that exists from a test or an AP exam. And then we have this world where schools are increasingly becoming more price conscious. So the 55% is the average discount rate for first year for full-time freshmen or full-time students in 21-22. So we see this sort of world where pricing is becoming more pressurized as demand is becoming more scarce. And then even to sort of insult all of these sort of negative facts, we have things like 35% of the college-age students report that they tend to distrust educational institutions, mostly because of scandals and other kinds of factors, news media and other kinds of things that are going on out there have led to a much less sort of overall reputation value for educational institutions. And then you have things that are even outside of the enrollment sphere and that are going to impact enrollment. Things like wealth moving from the boomer and traditional generations down to Xers and millennials. And this is not a small amount of wealth. It's 58 trillion as a sort of average predictor of how much money is just going to flow from older generations to younger generations. So I sort of think about this as a sort of X factor in that colleges are sort of wrestling with how do they fundraise to sort of offset poor enrollment at a time when money is also not tied to the loyalty that boomers and traditionals gave to higher ed. It is now in the hands of millennials and Xers who have kids with college aspirations and have many more assets than the previous generation, and the ability to select schools based on value over simply pure cost. So lots changing in the industry, and it's really quite remarkable how many things are changing all at once as we move forward. So, as I say, sort of pressure forces change. And so there are a number of trends here that I want to highlight that are really kind of in play that will help facilitate a pretty big strategic shift as we move forward. The first of those is just this new reality for lead generation. I sort of talked about the million test takers less in 2023 than 2019 earlier, but this is a complete set of very interesting facts. So you have a lot of pressure on lead generation with the institutions wanting more and more rich data. You have things like direct admit, the SCOTUS ruling, the FAFSA changes, the state level DEI pressures, the common sets of data that are now occurring as more and more of the lead generation companies look for names. They tend to end up overlapping and having more duplicative names available to institutions. All of this then coupled with then privacy laws that create a much different reality in terms of what you can and find in terms of targeting moving forward. We also have a generation that is really increasing their interest in values-based purchasing. So they're looking at things like mission and culture as a function of the type of institution they're looking for. They question even the value of higher education. They question the politics and societal impact of institutions more than they may value the specific program that they're looking at. And those are trends that are going to continue to become more pronounced as we see the buyer getting more in control of what they want out of their higher education. We have the rise, as maybe a response to this, the rise of the Chief Experience Officer, the CXO, and the correlating impacts on student success. So we have now institutions, especially coming out of the pandemic, looking at retention as a revenue source, something many institutions didn't value as much until they saw big declines in students returning in the pandemic. But now they care quite a bit. You see institutions developing cultures around customer experience and making sure that the experience is cultivated. This isn't about rock walls. This is about responding to students when they're in academic crisis at 11 p.m. or 2 in the morning, and how you mentally prepare to and physically prepare your processes to be able to address student needs at the times that they need it. This has created a pressure to sort of remarket the value of higher education, the degree, and to tie degrees to outcomes of some variety, whether that be grad school, whether that be a job, whether that be a really powerful learning capability that can carry you through life. And so we now see the student search era moving to year-round and buyer-led. So we see this new search is not going to be linear. It's non-linear because the buyer is in control. It isn't about managing a funnel as much as it's managing buyer expectations in that funnel. So thinking about things like how we address specific, personalized, and segmented communications, thinking about the number of channels we may have to manage based on the buyer's interests and desire to be in certain places. And most importantly, I think this is a shift in how marketing and enrollment, which were in many respects during the sort of growth fracture era, sort of enemies to some degree, are now going to have to collaborate and focus on yield as the main outcome as we move forward. And so we're at the end of the growth era, and what that is going to mean is pronounced and increased competition. It's going to mean pronounced a demographic compression. Demographic shift is not on here, but it's definitely even just as important as compression. We see post-pandemic dynamics that reflect what it will be like during the cliff era, but they're just the tactics and the strategies are already in place now because we experienced almost every aspect of what a cliff would look like in the pandemic era. And we see many institutions looking for differentiation through means of new markets and new programs. And that search is ongoing and omnipresent, and much greater degree of increase today than it was in the pandemic or pre-pandemic time. And so when we think about, enrollment as a funnel, and many still do, what I would like to suggest to you is that it looks a lot more like the right side of the screen than the left. So it's going to look less like a traditional funnel where there's, sort of different cycles, applications, admits, FAFSA filers, depositors, matriculants, and more like a non-linear ecosystem that is a multi-channel, that is much more complicated to manage. As I think about it, looking down into it from the top of the funnel, it looks quite different than it did during the growth era, for sure, where search may have been the biggest of all of the circles. Now, today, that's only a small fraction of what needs to be managed in today's modern enrollment search. And so if we think about the eras leading up to this sort of demand compressed era, this demand driven era, being the big top era, and no analogies to the circus, please, but the reality of a top of funnel strategy that was essentially put as many names in as you can and get a class of some variety back out at the bottom. We're now seeing this era moving to a yield focused shaped funnel, although there will never be an era where there's less names going in to the top of funnel, as is sort of portrayed by this graphic, as there will be going out. What this is meant to sort of prioritize is the opportunity is in the conversion rates and the yield rates at each of the areas of the funnel. And we want to see that we're focusing on increasing the percentage of yield at every spot in the funnel, because there won't be a function of putting just more and more names in the top to get some level of names at the bottom. You can put in as many names as you want, but everybody's got the same names because there's less names to go around. And so by definition, we have to recruit to retain, or recruit to push more and more yield all the way through the funnel to the very bottom, focusing on the percentage of overall matriculant yield as the major focus moving forward, and backing our way up from there. So the reality is we have a new approach that's needed. All of these changes that I've highlighted here really are a function of a new reality. And as a result, we have to think about new approaches. And when I mentioned it earlier, but we are thinking about this idea of how do we recruit to retain? How do we focus on retaining for retention and revenue purposes and outcome purposes, but also recruiting from the outset to retain, to be able to drive yield? And so philosophically, you really have to think about this as yield is really everything. And search, which was once something you'd outsource and hire somebody to manage from a distance for multi-years, is now a function of maybe you have a partner that's working with you on the strategy, but that you own the search, right? You as a university are the owner of search, and you are seeing the micro conversions that are happening in every aspect of the funnel. Something that Carnegie prides itself in the way that we partner with schools on search is to do just that, search in your instance, if you will. To recognize that students are in control, and that therefore, as a result of that, the cycle never ends. And that as a result of the focus on, the cycle never ending and the buyer in control, we have to think about authenticity and personalization as a key. And to us, our focus is on how do we better segment to drive results, and maybe use things like psychographics versus demographics as a way to start to speak to students on human terms, to be able to resonate and to create attractive language that's authentic to the institution to drive it forward. And so here we are at a point where we need a nonlinear multi-channel audience that's really in control, and we need to meet that in kind. So we need to be also nonlinear and multi-channel, because that's how your Gen Zs and Alphas are today. And so in short, we are really focusing here on how do we recruit to retain, or recruiting to retain, which is something interesting for enrollment leaders that don't always have retention as their main area of responsibility. Ultimately, though, I think we have to start thinking about this as sort of never-ending continuum that may go all the way through donor relations all the way at the end, using data in a powerful engine like Slate to be able to drive important conversions at every step in the process, whether you're a current student trying to drive towards graduation, whether you're a donor looking to give back, or whether you're a prospective student thinking about your institution or this institution as a potential place to get a degree from. And so when we think about student search, we're really thinking about it in these terms. So we think about it as a hive mind, right? So we need to think about yield and retention strategy as connected to prospect acquisition. That's how you recruit to retain. We need to think about targeted digital marketing that is just as effective as our in-house Slate CRM execution. So connected marketing and enrollment, not separated marketing and enrollment moving forward. And how we think about personalized creative and psychographic segmentation as potential ways to create relevant, optimized, and owned content as we move forward. And so if we break these down just a little bit, we want to think about prospect acquisition strategy as a sort of critical best practice for name buy that cultivates and identifies best fit students for your institution. We're looking at multiple executions. We're looking at unlimited names and sources, because why buy a specific number of inquiries when you can just buy unlimited names? That's how Carnegie approaches this world. Is we should look at all sources as broad as possible and allow for the ability to have an unlimited supply of names from the unlimited supply of sources as we look at search. This is a much smarter strategy than predicting how many students need to go into the top of the funnel to jive a matriculant class in today's world. And then thinking about proprietary student database access. So certain tools like College Express, in our case, giving hand raisers or warm leads that are served in institution for much more valuable conversion is an important aspect of this. And then also thinking about market opportunity indexing. So looking beyond just the home market, but looking at where are we intelligently going to be able to succeed with our institution's core culture, values, enrollment strategy, et cetera, and making sure that we find the markets that drive the successful future strategies and future classes for our institution. We think about in-house, as we say, in your instance CRM execution. So thinking about how do we set up campaigns for success? How do we create a data transparency? As I like to talk about it, many institutions are focused and mired in having to build their CRM in a continuous basis, whether that's building the next module of Salesforce and starting to choke on the number of modules that you're buying in terms of the cost of those modules in totality, or whether that's having a powerful engine like Slate, where you have every module built in, but no instruction manual. So Carnegie gets in the center of that and helps to create this sort of beautiful world where we can build quickly and give a client the profound benefit of being able to lift themselves out of the build and start to refine what is then a best practice operation. And thinking about sort of the overall execution as sort of a prospect to inquiry and full life or a full life cycle of communication, whether this is truly a search operation or whether that's really taking names from inquiry to matriculant and doing everything in between. And then, delivering that personalized experience that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are expecting these days. Most of us have learned that companies far and wide have become very knowledgeable about our habits and are very savvy in communicating with us about our needs in a way that is attractive to us, that enables us to purchase at a greater rate things that we like and things like that. Well, higher education is no different. We need to find ways to stand apart from our competition. And that is where personalized communication and personalized data can really be useful. So things like managing psychometric capabilities. So looking at the behaviors, the attitudes, the personality of prospects versus just looking at demographics to be able to cultivate a stronger message for them. And then using those to create advanced segmentation strategies that drive a better outcome for your yield. And that goes hand in hand with this idea of personalized creative, right? So pushing a much more engaged message and a much more thoughtful segmentation in different channels and on your website and in your attribution of content to be able to drive better results for your overall enrollment. And then I shouldn't forget to mention this idea of targeting your message with a much more intense and surgical digital approach. And the best firm in the country, of course I'm biased in saying this, is Carnegie. We are the industry's only digital Google Premier partner. And we are the most experienced digital partner in the space, as we brought digital to higher ed back in 2013. And then lastly, thinking about just overall yield and retention strategy. So how do you take your search strategy and connect the dots to things like retention strategies? So looking at individualized financial aid and student success modeling, looking at engagement scoring and overall operational excellence to be able to respond to maybe deficiencies you have in your relationship with marketing or in your systems or your processes, to make sure that you're optimizing the entirety of your enrollment operation from search all the way through to matriculation and retention of your class. And so there you have it, Carnegie's hive mind approach to search, thinking about this as a very responsive, relevant, optimized, and owned module where we do search for you in your instance. We do this in a way that is standout from the rest of the industry. And we look forward to engaging with you in the coming weeks and months on these conversations and explore the best way that we can serve you as clients moving forward. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. Take care.